He didn't whisper it. He didn't pull her aside. Harold Finch stood right there in the middle of the general store, loud enough for every soul within 20 feet to hear, and said, "Well, I suppose even a plow horse finds a stable eventually." He was talking about Marin Ashcroft. She was standing 3 feet away, holding a sack of flour she had just paid for with coins she'd counted out twice because she wasn't sure she had enough. She heard every word. So did Mrs. Calloway behind the counter. So did the two young women near the bolts of fabric who covered their mouths and looked away. And then the new cowboy, the one nobody knew yet, turned slowly from the far end of the counter and looked directly at Harold Finch with the kind of quiet that made a room go cold. If that had been you standing there holding that sack of flour, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if this kind of story moves something in you, if you've ever been the one standing there holding that flour while someone said the wrong thing too loud, then subscribe to this channel right now and follow this story all the way to the end. Every single week, we bring you stories like this one. Stories about real dignity, about love that comes when you've stopped expecting it, and about the moment an ordinary person decides they are done being invisible. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to Marin Ashcroft, because her story is only just beginning. Marin was 31 years old, which in the territory of Caldwell Flats in 1882 meant something specific and unkind. It meant you had been looked over. It meant the subject of your future had quietly shifted from when will she marry to who will she care for. It meant that at family suppers, people stopped asking about you directly and started talking around you, the way you talk around a piece of furniture that has always been there and therefore no longer requires comment. She had two sisters. Petra was 26 and had the kind of face that made men forget what they were saying mid-sentence. Clara was 23 and laughed easily, moved easily, filled a room the way firelight fills a room. Without trying, without thinking about it, just naturally bright. Marin had watched both of them bloom from a careful distance, the way you watch weather moving across a prairie you can't reach. She was not ugly. She had known that, in a distant, factual way, the same way she knew the height of the fence posts or the depth of the well, information she carried but rarely thought about. Her eyes were gray and serious. Her hands were strong. She was tall enough that it sometimes made men uncomfortable, and she had learned early to stand slightly smaller than she was, to fold herself inward at gatherings, to take up only the space that was clearly offered to her. Their father, Edmund Ashcroft, was a good man by most measures. He had never raised a hand to any of them. He worked hard, spoke plainly, and kept his word. But he had a particular blindness that good men sometimes carry without realizing it, the kind where the child who causes the least trouble receives the least attention, and eventually you stop seeing them not out of cruelty, but out of a simple, terrible habit. Marin had become invisible to her own family through no single event. It was slower than that. It was years of dinners where she cooked and served and cleaned and then sat at the far end of the table while her father talked with the boys and her mother fussed over Petra's hair and Clara told stories about things that had happened to her in town. It was the way her father would say, "Marin, what would we do without you?" in the same tone he used when the old fence held through a hard winter. Gratitude for a thing that had simply done what it was built to do. She had stopped expecting to be surprised by any of it. That was the thing about Harold Finch's comment in the general store. It hadn't shocked her the way it might have shocked someone else. What it had done was land in a place that was already tender, already worn thin from years of smaller versions of the same remark. You can only absorb so many variations of you are useful before you begin to wonder whether anyone has ever once looked at you and thought something else. She set the flour sack on the counter and took a slow breath. "Thank you, Mr. Finch," she said, because she had been raised to be polite, and because she was tired, and because saying what she actually thought would cost her more energy than she had that morning. Harold Finch was not a cruel man in the way that some men are cruel, deliberate and satisfied by it. He was the other kind, which was almost worse. The kind who says a terrible thing without malice, who genuinely believes he is being friendly or even complimentary, who would be confused and a little wounded if you pointed out the damage. I was 54, had a prosperous cattle operation on the eastern edge of the territory, and had appointed himself something of a social narrator for the community. The man who commented on things, who noted arrivals and departures, who could always be counted on to say out loud what everyone else was thinking quietly. I mean it kindly, he added, as though she might have missed that. A reliable woman is worth 10 pretty ones. Any man with sense knows it. The two women near the fabric bolts had turned back to their shopping, but the kind of turned back that means you are listening harder than before. Mrs. Calloway behind the counter found something extremely interesting to examine on the shelf beside her left ear. And the man at the far end of the counter, tall, sunburned at the back of the neck, in the way that meant he'd been working outdoors for weeks without a hat, set down the box of nails he'd been pricing and turned around fully. He was not from Caldwell Flats. Marin had noticed him when she came in the peripheral, automatic way she noticed most things. A habit of attention she'd developed over years of being responsible for details that others overlooked. New face. Mid-30s, maybe? Wore his clothes like they'd been worked in rather than put on for show. His hands, when she'd seen them briefly, had the same kind of roughness as her own, which she'd registered without meaning to and then put aside. He looked at Harold Finch, not at Marin, at Harold. "Is that so?" he said. It wasn't a question. It was the verbal equivalent of a door being held open just long enough for someone to realize they might not want to walk through it. Harold Finch blinked. "Pardon?" "Reliable." The man said the word like he was turning it over, checking its weight. "That's what you said. Reliable woman." "Well, yes. I meant it as a compliment." The man picked up his box of nails and turned back to the counter to pay. "Funny kind of compliment," he said, more to the nails than to Harold Finch. "Sounds more like something you'd say about a good mule." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room in which approximately 6 people have all decided simultaneously not to make eye contact with one another. Harold Finch made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a protest. He looked around the store as though he expected someone to agree with him, found no takers, and then remembered an errand he had forgotten and left. Marin stood very still. She was not accustomed to anyone saying anything on her behalf. The experience was strange in the way that unexpected kindness is always a little strange. It takes a moment to recognize it, and then it takes another moment to resist the impulse to deflect it, to say, "Oh, it doesn't matter, I'm used to it," because that response is also a habit. The habit of making yourself smaller so that other people don't have to feel uncomfortable about the space you weren't taking up anyway. Mrs. Calloway finished with the man's purchase, and he tucked the nails under his arm and picked up a paper-wrapped parcel she handed him. He turned to leave. He was going to walk past Marin on his way to the door. He did not look at her the way she expected. The way men sometimes did when they'd done something chivalrous, that particular expression of satisfaction, of "I behaved well, and now you should acknowledge it." He didn't do that. He almost didn't look at her at all. But then, at the last moment, before he reached the door, he slowed, just slightly. And he looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. Not pity, not interest in the romantic sense, not curiosity exactly, more like recognition. The way you look at someone when something about them reminds you of something true that you'd temporarily forgotten. "Afternoon," he said. "Afternoon," she said. He left. Marin stood there for another moment. Then she picked up her flour sack, said goodbye to Mrs. Calloway, and walked out into the flat white light of a September afternoon. She did not think about him again, or she tried not to. But the mind is a strange thing. It keeps hold of moments you haven't decided to remember, stores them sideways somewhere, and then surfaces them later when you're elbow deep in bread dough or staring at a fence line that needs mending, and you find yourself back in a general store, watching a stranger look at you like you were worth looking at. She learned his name 3 days later from her sister Clara, who had learned it from a woman at church, who had learned it from Mrs. Calloway, because information moved through Caldwell Flats, the way water moves through cracked ground, quickly, and through every available channel. Silas Mercer. He'd come up from Kansas, apparently, was building a homestead about 4 miles east of town on a piece of land he'd bought cheaply because everyone else had passed on it, which was either brave or foolish, depending on who you asked. Nobody seemed to know much else about him beyond the fact that he was quiet and paid cash and didn't drink, which made him interesting to some people and suspicious to others. "He's not much to look at," Clara said, in the particular voice she used when she was deciding whether something was worth her attention. "But he's got a good back on him." Their mother, Ruth, looked up from her mending with the instinctive alertness of a woman who has 2 unmarried daughters and a third one who has become so reliably unmarried that she has stopped factoring into the calculation. Where did you say he's building? East side, near the Hadley draw. Ruth went back to her mending. The east side near the Hadley draw was not promising land. There were easier places to make something grow. Well, he'll either figure it out or he won't. Marin was at the stove. She did not contribute to the conversation. She was already doing the math in her head about supper. What they had, what they needed, whether the potato supply would hold another week. And the name Silas Mercer was already beginning to settle back into the place where things go that don't concern you. Except, 4 days after that, she was at the market stalls at the edge of the main road, buying seed onions from old Mr. Pruitt, when she heard footsteps behind her pause and then hold. She turned. "We've met," Silas Mercer said. "Not have we met?" The definitive version, the one that skips the uncertainty and goes straight to the fact. General store last week. She hadn't expected to recognize him as fast as she did. But she did. "I remember," she said. He nodded once, as though she'd confirmed something he wasn't entirely sure of. Then he bought nothing from Mr. Pruitt and stood there for a moment in the way of a man who is trying to decide whether he is about to do something and has not entirely decided yet, but is leaning. "I'm building out east," he said. "My cooking is approximately terrible." She waited. "I wondered if you'd have supper with me sometime. I'd cook. It would be bad, but I'd cook." The word "sometime" was doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. She could feel it, the careful vagueness of it, the way it left her every possible exit. She looked at him. He held the look without flinching, but also without the particular intensity that sometimes made her want to step backward. He just looked back, steady, the way you look at a horizon, because it's there and because it's worth looking at. Nobody had ever asked her first. That was the thought that arrived, fully formed, before she could stop it. Not one of the first. Not mostly. Nobody. Every man who had ever shown any passing interest in Marin Ashcroft had done so after circling through Petra, or Clara, or someone else, and had arrived at Marin the way you arrive at a road you've chosen because the other one was closed. She had known this. She had told herself she did not mind it. She had believed herself most of the time. She opened her mouth to say she would think about it. What came out instead was, "When?" Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile exactly. Something quieter than that. "Saturday," he said, "if that works." "That works," she said. She bought her seed onions. He tipped his hat in a way that seemed more habitual than performative and walked off in the direction of the feed store. She walked home carrying the onions and a peculiar sensation she had no immediate name for. Something between nervousness and a door opening that she had stopped expecting anyone to open. She did not tell her mother when she got home. She set the onions down in the root cellar and went back out to fix the section of fence that had been leaning for 3 weeks. And she worked until the light started going thin, and she thought about what she had said yes to and whether she had made a mistake, and she decided she probably had. And then she decided she would go anyway. That Saturday arrived with the particular unhelpfulness of important days. It came too fast and also seemed to take forever, the way time moves when you are trying not to think about something and thinking about it constantly. She told her mother she was visiting a friend. Her mother said fine without looking up, which was its own small wound, the casual kind, the ones that don't bleed but leave a mark. Clara was already out somewhere, and Petra was upstairs with her hair, and her father was in the barn, and nobody asked where she was going. And she walked the 4 miles east in the cooling late afternoon air with a pie dish covered in a cloth, because she had baked a pie the night before, and she didn't know why, except that her hands needed something to do, and she had all the ingredients. She found his homestead by the smoke from a fire that was clearly burning harder than it needed to, which turned out to be because his oven was not properly drafting yet, and everything was hotter than he'd intended. He was standing outside the cabin when she arrived, in the way of a man who has been outside the cabin waiting with studied casualness for a while. He saw the pie dish and said, with genuine feeling, "Thank God." She laughed. She hadn't expected to laugh. Not this early, not this easily. It surprised her enough that she laughed again at herself for being surprised. "I told you my cooking was terrible," he said. "I know, I didn't bring it because I doubted you." She paused. "Maybe I doubted you a little." He looked at the pie dish and then at her, and there was that expression again. The recognition, the thing she didn't have a name for yet. "Come in," he said, "and I apologize in advance for the smell. The cabin was small and real and unfinished in the way of things that are being built by one person who knows exactly what they're doing but has a limited number of hours in a day. It didn't look like anyone's idea of a home yet. It looked like the early parts of effort: raw wood, the smell of sawdust and smoke, two chairs that didn't match, a table that was clearly handmade and slightly uneven. She sat down at that uneven table and set the pie dish in the center of it, and Silas Mercer served supper, which was, as promised, not good, though not as bad as the warning had suggested, and they talked. She had expected awkward silence. She had prepared for it, had planned things she might say to fill it, had built herself a small set of acceptable conversational topics, the way you pack a bag for a trip you're not sure about. She didn't need any of it. He asked her questions and then listened to the answers. Not the surface kind of listening. Not the kind where you wait for the other person to finish so you can say the next thing you were already planning to say. The other kind. The kind where you catch a word partway through and follow it somewhere unexpected, where you ask a follow-up that proves you were actually there for what was just said. "What do you love?" he asked her, somewhere around the middle of the meal, out of nothing and with complete seriousness. She set down her fork. "What? What do you love?" "Things you love. Not things you do. Things you love." Nobody had asked her that. She understood immediately, in the way you understand things that cut through years of smaller questions, that nobody had ever asked her that, not like this, not expecting a real answer that wasn't also somehow about what she could provide. She thought about it honestly. "Mornings," she said finally, "very early, before anyone else is up, the half hour when the light is just starting to change." He nodded. He was watching her the way someone watches something they've been trying to see clearly and are finally seeing. "Gardens," she said. "I know that sounds—" "It doesn't sound like anything," he said. "Keep going." She kept going. She talked about things she had never said out loud to anyone, because nobody had ever made the particular kind of quiet space in which those things could be said. She talked about the way certain mornings on the prairie felt like they belonged only to you. She talked about the satisfaction of planting a seed and understanding, in some deep and uncomplicated place, that you had made something possible. She talked about how she had once read a book about the ocean 3 times because she had never seen it, and the description made her feel she might never need to, and then she caught herself and said she was sorry for going on. "Don't," he said. Just that word. Don't. She stopped apologizing and looked at him across the uneven table in the small, unfinished cabin with the fire going too hot, and the food that wasn't good enough, and something moved in her chest that she hadn't expected, something that felt inconveniently like hope. She was 31 years old. She had been invisible for most of it. She drove the 4 miles home in the dark with the empty pie dish, and the careful, frightened sensation of a woman who has been offered something she has wanted for a long time and can't quite believe has been offered to her and is already beginning to look for the reason it can't last. She did not sleep well that night. That was the first sign that something had shifted in a way she couldn't simply fold back up and put away. She lay in the narrow bed she had slept in since childhood, in the room she had shared with Clara, until Clara decided she wanted the room across the hall, and their mother had said yes without asking Marin whether she minded the change, and she stared at the ceiling and tried to be sensible. She was good at being sensible. It was one of the things she was known for. Marin Ashcroft, sensible, reliable, useful as a good fence post. She tried to apply that same quality now, tried to list the reasons why a single supper at an unfinished cabin 4 miles east of town was not something worth losing sleep over. The list was not convincing. She kept coming back to the same moment. Not the compliment, if you could even call it one. Not the food, which had genuinely been as bad as promised. Not even the conversation, though the conversation had been the kind she hadn't had in so long, she'd almost forgotten it was possible. She kept coming back to the moment she'd started to apologize. "I'm sorry for going on." And he had said don't and meant it, and looked at her while he meant it. It was such a small thing, one word. And she was 31 years old and lying awake over one word from a man she'd known for approximately one evening, which was embarrassing, and she knew it was embarrassing, and she lay there being embarrassed and awake, and unable to do anything about either condition. By the time the sky started going gray at the edges, she had made a decision, which was that she was not going to make any decisions. She was going to go about her life the way she always went about her life, and she was not going to rearrange herself around something that had a very reasonable chance of amounting to nothing. Men passed through Caldwell Flats. Men bought land east of town and sold it by spring because the land was hard and the isolation was harder. Silas Mercer had been polite and interesting and had asked her a question nobody had thought to ask before. And that was all that had happened, and it was enough by itself, and she would not build anything on top of it that wasn't there. She got up before anyone else and started the stove and made the coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching the light change over the flat land and felt, despite everything, the quiet particular pleasure she'd told him about, the half hour before anyone else is up. Hers. She held it and tried not to think about the fact that she had told a near stranger about it, and that he had listened like it mattered. She failed at not thinking about it. Clara came down at 7:30 with her hair loose and her face soft from sleep, poured herself coffee, and said without looking up, "You came home late." It wasn't that late. After dark. Not long after. Clara looked at her then, over the rim of the coffee cup, with the particular attention of a younger sister who has always known that her older sister has a life, but rarely thought to pay attention to what was in it. "Where did you go?" Maren considered the options. She knew what would happen if she said Silas Mercer's name in this kitchen. She knew the exact shape of what would follow. The interest, the questions, the speculation, the way her mother would look up from whatever she was doing with that particular alertness, and the way the whole thing would become a family conversation before it had even become anything at all. She was not willing to hand something this fragile to that process before she understood what it was herself. "Out," she said. "I went to see about something." Clara studied her for another moment. Clara was not stupid. She was in fact sharper than most people gave her credit for, because she wore her brightness so openly that people assumed she must be surface level all the way down. She knew when Maren was keeping something. She had always known. The question was whether she was going to press on it this morning, and after a moment she apparently decided she wasn't, because she took her coffee and went back upstairs, and Maren exhaled slowly into the steam from her own cup. That was Sunday. By Tuesday, without any particular decision being made about it, she found herself walking past the feed store on an errand that did not require her to walk past the feed store, and Silas Mercer was not there, and she walked home slightly faster than she'd walked out, irritated with herself. By Thursday, she had decided the whole thing was finished. Nothing had happened. It was fine. On Friday afternoon, he appeared at the gate of the Ashcroft property with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that said he was aware this might be unwelcome and had come anyway, which she found, against her best intentions, extremely difficult to be annoyed by. "I brought these," he said, and held out a small bunch of prairie wildflowers, the kind that grew in the draws and along the creek beds, yellow and white and a faded sort of purple, tied together with a piece of string that had clearly been the nearest available string rather than something chosen for the purpose. They were slightly crushed on one side where he'd been holding them wrong. "They're not—" He looked at them. "They're not in great shape." "They're fine," she said. She took them. "Why are you here?" "I wanted to know if you'd walk with me." "Walk?" "Out toward the creek, if you want. Or not." He put his hat back on, then seemed to realize it wasn't the right moment for the hat, and took it off again. I wasn't sure if it was too soon to ask. The part of her that had spent 31 years being careful said, "Yes, make an excuse. Be sensible." The part of her that had lain awake last Saturday night over one word said something else entirely. "Let me tell my mother I'm going," she said. She told her mother she was taking a walk. Her mother said, "Don't be long, there's supper to think about," and did not ask with whom, because it had apparently not occurred to Ruth Ashcroft that Maren might have a with whom. They walked for almost 2 hours. The creek was low from a dry August, running over pale rocks, and they followed it north where the cottonwoods were starting to turn at the edges. He talked about the homestead, what he was trying to do with the land, the problems he'd run into, the way the soil on the east slope was rockier than anything he'd worked before. She asked questions, real ones, because she knew land and she knew what made it difficult, and she'd spent enough years coaxing things to grow out of resistant ground that she had actual opinions about it. He noticed that. She could tell by the way he listened, not the way people listen when they're being polite, not the "you're so smart for a woman" kind of listening, but the straightforward kind, where what you've said gets factored into what he says next, where the information is simply received and used. "The east slope," she said. "You'd want to terrace it if you can, and whatever you plant there first, plant it deep and don't expect much the first season." "How do you know that?" Because I've been working our East Field for 6 years, and it took me 3 years to figure that out by trial and error, and I'd rather save you the error part." He smiled at that. A real one, not the front-facing kind. "Did anyone help you figure it out?" "No." He nodded, and something in the nod told her he had already understood that without needing her to say it. They walked a while without talking, the companionable kind of quiet, and she noticed she wasn't filling it the way she usually filled silences, frantically, apologetically, with useful information or helpful observations, making herself earn the space she was taking up. She was just walking, next to a person who seemed content to have her there. This was when she began to understand she was in some danger. Not the dramatic kind, the slow, quiet kind, the kind that looks like an ordinary afternoon by a low creek in September, the kind that you don't recognize until you're already in the middle of it and the exit is further behind you than you realized. She walked home alone. He'd offered to walk her back and she'd said no. She knew the way, which was true, and also a way of keeping some of herself intact. And she went inside and helped with supper and said nothing, and that night she lay in her bed and admitted to herself, only to herself, in the dark, where it was safe to admit things. She liked him. She liked him, and she didn't know yet whether that was a gift or the beginning of something that was going to cost her in ways she couldn't predict. Both, she suspected. Probably both. The weeks that followed had a rhythm she hadn't expected. He did not push. That was the first thing she noticed. He seemed entirely capable of moving at whatever pace the thing required, without the impatience or the manufacturing of urgency that she associated with men who were interested in a woman primarily as a problem to be resolved. He showed up. He asked. Sometimes she said yes, and sometimes she said she had work that needed doing, and he said fine and left. And he never made her feel that the work was an excuse or a rejection, because with him it didn't need to be. He came to her fence once, the bad section on the north side that had been listed in her head for 2 weeks. He didn't offer to help. He just arrived while she was working on it, sat down on the ground nearby, and started telling her about a fence he'd tried to put up on his own land that kept falling because he'd underestimated the frost depth. And somehow they were talking about fence posts for 20 minutes, and she had repaired 3 sections without noticing she was doing it. He didn't touch the fence. He didn't suggest she was doing it wrong. He just kept her company while she worked, which was so simple and so uncommon that it caught in her chest every time she thought about it later. He brought things. Not expensive things. He didn't have that kind of money, and she wouldn't have wanted that kind of thing anyway. A jar of honey from a farm further north. A piece of ribbon he'd traded for because it was the same gray as her eyes, which he told her plainly and without performance when he gave it to her, the way you state a fact. A book he'd picked up second-hand, battered at the spine, that was about the western coast and the ocean, because she had mentioned the ocean once and apparently he had remembered. She stood holding that book for a long moment before she could say anything. "You remembered that," she said. "I remember most things," he said. "Most things you say." She looked down at the book so he wouldn't see her face. She was 31 years old and she had cried exactly 3 times in the last decade, and she was not going to make this the 4th, not over a second-hand book about the ocean. She got it under control. She thanked him. She went inside and put the book on the shelf beside her bed, and that night she read the first 30 pages and then put it down and looked at the ceiling and felt the precise, complicated weight of being seen by someone for the first time in as long as she could remember. It was Mrs. Calloway who said it first. She said it to Martha Pruitt, who said it to Delia Barnes, who mentioned it in the presence of Clara, who came home and repeated it to their mother with the particular relish of someone delivering information she finds personally enjoyable. "People are saying," Clara said, setting herself down at the kitchen table with an elaborate lack of concern, "that Silas Mercer is courting Marin." Their mother looked up from her mending. The alertness was there, the same as always, but there was something else in it now. Something careful, calculating, the way her eyes moved toward Marin at the stove and then back to Clara. "Are they?" Ruth said. "Martha Pruitt said he's been seen with her 3 times now, walking, and that he went to the Ashcroft gate with flowers last month." "They weren't very good flowers," Marin said, without turning around. The kitchen went quiet. Then Clara said, "So it's true." Marin set down the spoon she was holding and turned around and looked at her mother and her sister and saw the exact thing she had been afraid of seeing. The recalibration happening in real time, The mental arithmetic of two women who had not previously included her in certain calculations now rapidly trying to figure out what it meant and what to do with it. "He's been kind to me," Marin said. "That's all I'll say about it." "He's building on the Hadley Draw land," her mother said. It wasn't a question. It was the opening argument. "I know where he's building. That land is difficult." "I know that too." "A man starting from nothing, Marin, on land that nobody else wanted. You'd be working yourself to the bone." And here it was. Here was the thing she had been waiting for, the thing she had known would come eventually, the scaffolding under her mother's concern. That was not really concern, and not really about the land. It was the old equation, the one that had been applied to Marin her whole life. Your value is your labor, and therefore your future is best calculated in terms of how much labor it will require of you, and whether the investment is sound. "You've been working me to the bone here for 15 years, Marin said. She said it quietly. Not with anger. She was too tired for the kind of anger that shouts. But she said it clearly, and it landed in the kitchen the way a rock lands in still water, and the silence after it had the quality of something that couldn't be taken back. Her mother looked at her. Her mother's face did something complicated, started to form a protest, then stopped, then started again. "That's not fair," Ruth said finally. "I know," Marin said. "I know it's not fair, but it's true." She picked up the spoon and went back to the stove, and nobody said anything else about Silas Mercer that evening, and supper was eaten in a silence that was more like aftermath than peace. Clara found her later, out by the well. "I didn't mean it the way it sounded," Clara said. "I know you didn't. Are you angry with me?" Marin thought about it honestly, because she tried as a policy to be honest with herself when she could make herself do it. "Not angry," she said, "just tired." Clara leaned against the well casing and looked at her older sister with an expression that Marin had not seen on her face before, or perhaps had seen and not registered, because she had not been in the habit of looking for it. It was the expression of someone who is seeing you differently than they were seeing you 5 minutes ago, and is not entirely sure what to do with that. "Do you love him?" Clara asked. "Clara, I'm asking seriously." Marin looked out at the land, the flat dark of it under the early stars. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I think I might want to find out, and I think that should be allowed to be enough, for now." Clara nodded. She reached out and touched Marin's arm, briefly, with the uncertain touch of someone who wishes they had been better at this kind of thing and is trying to start now. Then she went back inside, and Marin stayed at the well a little longer, looking at the stars, feeling the strange, uneasy fullness of a life that was no longer shaped exactly the way she'd thought it was. The trouble was that the community of Caldwell Flats had opinions, and the community of Caldwell Flats was not in the habit of keeping its opinions to itself. It started with something small. A Sunday after the service, gathered on the steps in the way communities do, and Mrs. Barnes saying to Mrs. Pruitt loudly enough for Marin to hear 3 steps away, "Well, I suppose it makes sense. A man starting from nothing needs a woman who knows how to work. He's being practical." And Mrs. Pruitt nodding in the way that means agreement without quite having said anything, the coward's agreement. She was being praised. She knew it was meant as a compliment. That was the thing that made it impossible to simply brush off. It was delivered with warmth, with genuine approval, as though the women saying it believed they were saying something kind. A man had chosen her, and the reason they approved of his choice was the same reason nobody had chosen her for 31 years. She was useful. She was capable. She would not be a burden. Silas Mercer had chosen Marin Ashcroft because she was practical. That was the story the town told, and it was a story that arrived in the place inside her that was already tender, already waiting for a reason to doubt. And it took root there the way certain seeds take root, fast, efficient, in the dark, reaching down before anything shows above the surface. She went to meet him the following Wednesday with the story already growing in her, though she hadn't admitted that yet, not even to herself. He'd made coffee, the one thing he could be trusted to do with consistent success, and she sat at his uneven table and held the cup and looked at the grain of the wood and tried to be present and kept slipping sideways into her own head. "You're somewhere else," he said. "I'm here." "Your body's here. The rest of you went somewhere." She looked at him. He was watching her the way he always watched her, that direct, unhurried attention that she still hadn't entirely learned to be comfortable under. "People talk," she said finally. "People talk everywhere. About us." He was quiet for a moment, waiting for the rest of it. "They think you're being practical," she said. "They think you chose me because I can work, because I'd be useful on hard land." She paused. "They're not saying it meanly. That's what makes it hard." Silas looked at his coffee. He turned the cup once in his hands and was silent long enough that she began to regret saying it, began to construct the apology she would offer, and then he looked up at her. "The first time I saw you," he said, "you were paying for flour. You counted the coins twice. You thought nobody was watching." She didn't say anything. "The second time was at Pruitt's stall, and you were asking about seed onions, and you touched them before you bought them, like you were listening to them. I thought, there's somebody who pays attention." He set the cup down. "Then Harold Finch said what he said, and I watched your face when he said it. You didn't get angry. You just got quiet, in a way that had a lot of weight to it, like you'd been carrying that same thing for a long time." Marin's hands were very still around her cup. "I didn't ask you to supper because I needed somebody to cook," he said. "I asked you because you were the most interesting person in that room, and I didn't know how to walk out without saying something to you first." She wanted to believe him. That was the problem. She wanted to believe him so much that she immediately distrusted how much she wanted it. "You can't know that after one afternoon," she said. "I know I asked you before I knew anything about your cooking." The corner of his mouth moved, which, as it turned out, was a sound decision. But it wasn't the reason. She looked at him for a long moment, then she looked away, out the one small window at the October light, thin and golden and going early. "I'm not saying I don't believe you," she said carefully. "I'm saying I need you to understand that I have spent a very long time being valued for my usefulness, and I don't always know anymore how to separate one thing from another." He absorbed this without rushing a response. "That's fair," he said. "It's a mess, is what it is." "Yes," he said. "It is. But it's your mess, and I'm not going anywhere. So—" She almost laughed. It was such an unsentimental thing to say, so entirely unlike the declarations in the few novels she'd read. And precisely because it was not a declaration, it felt more like something she could hold without it breaking. "Okay," she said. "Okay." They drank their coffee. Outside, the wind came up the way it did in October, that long, straight wind from the north with the cold in it, and the cabin walls held against it imperfectly, the way walls do when they're new and still settling, and she sat at his uneven table and let herself be, for a while, exactly where she was. But doubt, once it takes root, does not respond well to a single good conversation. It has its own patience. It waits. It waited through a pleasant November afternoon when Silas walked her to the edge of his east field and showed her what he'd done with the terrace she'd suggested, and she felt the clean satisfaction of a thing she'd known working the way she'd known it would. It waited through the evening. She met him by accident at the Dallow family's gathering, and he found her across the room within 5 minutes of arriving and came directly to her. Not to Petra, who was standing near the door wearing her best dress. Not to Clara, who was in the center of the room being laughed at, and to Marin, who was near the window with a cup she wasn't drinking from, and sat down next to her and said, "Thank God. Give me 5 minutes before I have to talk to anyone else." She had felt, in that moment, genuinely glad. Simply, straightforwardly glad, without the complicated underlay of doubt. And then Thomas Brierly's wife, Eleanor, had drifted over with her particular smile, the one that was always warmest when it was doing the most damage, and said to Silas, "We think it's wonderful what you've done. Choosing a girl who'll actually be a help to you. Some men have more sense than to be blinded by a pretty face." And she patted Marin's arm while she said it, the way you pat something you want to seem fond of, and drifted away again. Marin had looked at Silas. He'd closed his eyes for 1 second, the briefest wince of someone who has just heard something detonate, and then opened them again. "She means it kindly," Marin said, the same word she'd been saying for 31 years. "I know," he said. "That's the part I find hard to forgive." She looked at him. "It's harder to be angry at something that isn't trying to hurt you," he said. "It just keeps happening anyway, and there's no one to be angry at." She thought about that for a long time afterward, the precision of it, the accuracy. He had named the thing she had been carrying for so long that she'd stopped knowing it had a name. There was no one to be angry at. That was exactly it. The kindly meant reductions, the warmly delivered diminishments. The approving comments that told her exactly what she was worth to the people around her and were delivered with smiles. There was no villain. There was no single moment of cruelty she could point to and say, "There, that is the thing that was done to me." There was only the accumulated weight of years of being seen as functional rather than beloved. And the realization arrived at slowly and without drama that it had cost her something she was only beginning to understand. December came in cold and early. The first frost hit before most people were ready for it. She lost 2 rows of winter kale to it. She stood at the edge of the kitchen garden in the gray morning and looked at the blackened leaves and felt the familiar flatness of a loss. She should have prevented if she'd been paying better attention, and was aware, standing there, that she had not been paying as much attention to her garden lately as she usually did, because her attention had started going other places. She thought about what that meant. She was not a woman who let herself be distracted from necessary things. She never had been. It was a kind of pride with her, the reliability of her attention. And here were 2 dead rows of kale to show her what happened when she stopped being that version of herself. She told herself it was the garden that was making her feel unsteady. She was a fairly good liar, but not perfect. Silas noticed something was wrong before she told him anything. He did that, picked up the shift in her long before she volunteered it, which she found simultaneously comforting and alarming, because nobody had known her well enough to do that before, and she was not sure she was entirely ready for it. "You've been quieter," he said. They were on his porch in early December, cold enough that their breath made small clouds. "Different quiet than usual." "There's a usual?" "You're quiet in a settled way, mostly. Like you're thinking about something particular and you're okay with the thinking. This is different. This is like you're trying not to think about something." She looked at the land. His land, rocky and hard and patient. "I lost 2 rows of kale to the frost," she said, "because I wasn't paying attention." "Is that what you're worried about, the kale?" "No," she admitted. He waited. She had gotten better over these months, at not filling his silences before they were finished. It had been a thing she'd had to learn, that he wasn't waiting for her to rescue the quiet, that the quiet between them was allowed to just exist. "People say things," she said finally, "and I know they mean well. And I know you. I know what you've said to me. I believe you. I do." She paused. "But there's this thing that happens where I'll be fine and then someone will say something and I'll start wondering if you know what you're getting, if you've thought through what this looks like. A woman who isn't beautiful and isn't young and comes with a family that's never quite treated her right, and a piece of land that isn't hers and no money, and—" "Marin," she stopped. "Do you think," he said very carefully, "that I haven't thought about what I'm asking?" She didn't answer. "I've been building something out here for 8 months," he said. "By myself. I know exactly what this is and what it isn't, and I know what I need and what I don't, and I know what I want, which is a different category entirely from the other 2. I want you here. Not your labor. Not your usefulness. You." He paused. "And I am not going to keep proving that to you every time someone says something stupid in earshot, because people are always going to say something stupid in earshot. That's people." She felt the complicated pull of it, the truth of what he was saying, and the deep, stubborn resistance of a woman who has been trained to distrust kindness because kindness, in her experience, had always come with a price. "I'm not saying this to be difficult," she said. "I know you're not. You're saying it because you're scared and you've been hurt, and those are reasonable things to be." He looked at her steadily. "But I need you to decide what you're going to do with that, because I can't make the decision for you, and I wouldn't if I could." The cold sat between them, and beyond the porch the land lay flat and dark and enormous, the way land in December always looks. Stripped down, honest, asking nothing. She had always found December land easier to trust than the summer version. It didn't pretend. It showed you exactly what it was. "Give me time," she said. "You have it," he said. "You always had it." She went home in the dark for the second time since she'd known him, and this time she didn't feel the cautious hope of those early weeks. She felt the older, heavier thing that hope becomes when it has survived a few hard tests and is still there, battered and inconvenient and refusing to go away. She was afraid. She knew that now without flinching from it. She was afraid because she had begun to want something more than she had allowed herself to want anything in a very long time. and wanting things that much was a kind of risk she had protected herself against for years by simply not wanting them. She lay awake again that night. The ceiling was the same ceiling, the bed was the same bed, but the woman lying in it was not quite the same woman she had been in September, and she could feel the difference, and she did not entirely know yet whether to be grateful for that or terrified. And she suspected, in her most honest self, that the answer was both and that there was no clean way through it except forward. She closed her eyes. The wind moved outside, the December kind, long and uncompromising, and she let it push against the walls of the house that had always been her father's house, and not quite her own, and she thought about what it might feel like to be inside walls that were hers. She thought about it for a long time before she slept. She gave herself time. She had asked for it, and he had given it without condition, which was itself a kind of answer to the question she hadn't been able to stop asking, but she was not yet ready to let that answer settle into certainty. January came, and with it the particular cruelty of a plains winter, the kind that doesn't announce itself with drama, but simply arrives and stays, grinding and gray, turning the world into a study in endurance. She had endured many winters. She knew how to do it, the way you know how to do a thing you've done so many times that the knowing has moved from your mind into your body. You keep the stove fed. You keep the animals watered. You watch the sky the way your father taught you to watch it, reading what's coming before it arrives. She kept herself busy. This was also something she knew how to do. She repaired 2 sections of the barn roof before her father noticed they needed repairing. She reorganized the root cellar, pulling the soft potatoes before they could turn the others. She helped Clara hem a skirt and listened to Clara talk about a young man from the Dallow family who had smiled at her in a particular way at the December gathering, and she asked the right questions and said the right things and felt, the entire time, a split attention, part of her present in the warm kitchen and part of her 4 miles east, wondering. She had not seen Silas since the porch conversation. She had told him she needed time, and he had given it to her without protest. And now she was 12 days into that time, and the silence had begun to feel less like breathing room and more like something she'd built around herself that she wasn't sure was protection or just another way of being alone. On the 14th day, she walked to his homestead. Not because she had decided anything. She told herself that. She was walking because she needed to move, and the weather had broken enough to allow it, and the direction happened to be east. She held that story about herself for approximately half a mile before she let it go and admitted she was walking to his homestead because she could not stop thinking about the way he had said, "You always had it," and meant it entirely, without leverage or performance, the way a man states something he considers obvious. She found him on the east slope. He had started on the terracing, was deep in it actually, the work considerably further along than she would have expected. The ground broken and shaped in a way that showed someone had been working through the cold with a determination that paid no attention to comfort. He was crouched over the lower edge of the second terrace, checking the grade, and he didn't hear her coming until she was close enough that the cold grass crunched under her boots, and he looked up. He did not look surprised exactly. He looked like a man who has been carrying a particular weight for 2 weeks and has just been told he can set it down. "You started without me," she said, looking at the terracing. "I had time," he said. She came and crouched down beside him to look at the grade. It was almost right. Almost. "You'll want this edge a half-inch lower, or the drainage will pool at the north corner in spring." He looked where she was pointing. "You're sure?" "I've been looking at how water moves on this kind of slope for 15 years. Yes, I'm sure." He looked at it for another moment. Then he stood and handed her the level he'd been using, and she took it and checked the grade herself and adjusted her estimate, and they went back and forth about it for 10 minutes in the technical, unemotional way of 2 people discussing a problem that has a correct answer, and she realized somewhere in the middle of it that the doubt that had been living in her chest for weeks had gone quiet. Not gone. She was not naive enough to believe one conversation and a slope grade could dissolve what had accumulated over a lifetime. But quiet. Set aside in the presence of something more immediate. When they'd settled the grade question, he made coffee, and she sat at his still uneven table and wrapped her hands around the cup and said, without preamble, "I'm sorry I went away." "You didn't go away, you asked for space." "I know what I asked for. I'm apologizing for needing it." He shook his head. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Apologize for being human." He sat down across from her. "You've been through... I don't know everything you've been through, but I know enough to understand why you'd need to sit with something before you trusted it. That's not a fault. That's a person who's been burned learning to check the stove." She looked at him. There was something she wanted to say, and she was trying to find the version of it that was honest without being more vulnerable than she could bear to be, which was a calculation she had been running for decades and had never quite solved. "I'm afraid," she said, "of getting this wrong." "Wrong how?" "Of wanting it too much. Of making it into something and then finding out it wasn't that. Or finding out it is that, but I've ruined it by not trusting it soon enough. There's a version of this that goes wrong on every side, and I can see all of them. How many of them end with both of us trying?" She thought about that. "None." "Then every version that ends with both of us trying is the same version," he said. "And I'm still trying, so." She looked at him for a long moment and felt the thing inside her that had been contracted and careful for weeks begin, slowly, to ease. "Okay," she said, for the second time in this same cabin, at this same uneven table, the word that meant more than it sounded like. He smiled, the real one, not the front-facing kind, and poured her more coffee, and they sat together in the January cold with the stove going and talked about the terracing and the spring planting schedule and the book she'd read about the ocean, and none of it was remarkable except in the way that mattered most, which was that it was real. February was easier. She couldn't have told you the exact day it shifted. It wasn't a single moment, but an accumulation of small ones, the way land changes across a season, too slowly to watch directly but obvious when you compare now to then. She stopped bracing for his company and started simply being in it. She stopped monitoring herself as closely, the way you stop checking for ice on a road that's been thawed for weeks. He met her father in February, officially. They had seen each other in passing. Caldwell Flats was small enough that eventually everyone sees everyone. But Marin brought him to the ranch one Thursday afternoon with the particular care of a woman who is doing a thing she is not certain about but has decided to do anyway. Her father was in the barn. He came out when he heard voices, and she watched him take in Silas with the careful, weathered eye of a man who had spent 40 years reading land and people and livestock and knew how to assess something quickly without appearing to. Edmund Ashcroft shook Silas Mercer's hand and said, "You're the one building on the Hadley Draw land." "Yes, sir." "Ambitious." "Or foolish. Jury's still out." Her father made a sound that might have been a laugh in a man less reserved. "Hadley tried that land for 8 years. Never made much of it." "I heard that," Silas said. "Also heard he didn't have help." Her father glanced at Marin. It was a brief glance, sidelong, but she caught it. Caught the thing in it, the thing she couldn't quite read, some combination of elements she didn't have the vocabulary for yet. "Come in for coffee," her father said. It was the only invitation he gave, and it was enough. They sat in the kitchen, 3 of them, her mother upstairs for reasons she had cited vaguely, Clara conspicuously absent with impressive timing, and drank coffee and talked about the land and the winter and the price of cattle feed, the way men talk when they are learning each other's character through the safe medium of practical conversation. She mostly listened. She watched her father and Silas circle each other through the innocuous topics, taking measurements. And she thought about what she was seeing. Her father, who had treated her as functional for 15 years, now having to reckon with the fact that she had a life outside his reckoning of her. A life in the form of a man sitting at his kitchen table who had come specifically and only for her. Her father shook Silas's hand again when he left and said, "Come back." That was all. 2 words. But from Edmund Ashcroft they carried the weight of a longer speech. She walked out to the gate with Silas, and he said, "He doesn't say much." "No. Neither do you, usually, when you're figuring something out." She looked at him. "You think he's figuring something out?" "I think he's looking at his daughter for the first time in a while," Silas said, "and I think it might be giving him a complicated morning." She watched him walk down the road toward the east and stood at the gate in the cold February air and let herself feel carefully the complicated thing she felt, which was something between vindication and grief, the particular mixture that comes when you have been invisible for a long time and someone starts to see you, and you realize that being seen now does not repair the years of not being seen, but you are grateful anyway, in spite of everything. March arrived, and with it the first green things and the sense that the ground was becoming possible again. She started spending more time at his homestead, not exclusively, not in a way that abandoned her responsibilities at the ranch, but in a way that was becoming understood by both of them as natural, as part of the structure of their weeks. She knew where he kept his tools. She knew which side of the porch door you had to lift slightly as you opened it because the hinge was still not seated right. She knew that he drank his first cup of coffee standing at the window looking east and the second one sitting down, and that this was not habit so much as ritual, though she doubted he knew the difference. He knew things about her too. He knew she went quiet in a particular way when she was working through something difficult and had learned not to break into that quiet, to let it run its course. He knew she got up before everyone and that the early morning was sacred to her. He knew she had opinions about everything but stated most of them as questions, still as though waiting to be told she was wrong, and he had taken to simply agreeing with her assessments when they were right, without comment, so that gradually she was beginning to state them as statements instead. These were small things, but they were the kinds of small things that mean you know someone, and she was aware that she knew him, and that this was no longer the frightening fact it had once been, but something else, something she was beginning to allow herself to call good. And then the town decided to have an opinion about it, which was, she supposed, inevitable. It started with a conversation at the market stalls that she was not part of but was reported to her, third hand, with the particular embarrassed care of someone delivering information they believe you should have but don't want to be responsible for delivering. Delia Barnes had apparently said to someone who had said to someone who had said to Clara that it was good Silas had picked Marin because Petra would have made his life difficult, and Clara was too young, and honestly it was the smartest thing a poor man could do. Choose a woman who already knew hardship and wouldn't expect much from the marriage. Wouldn't expect much. She sat with that one for a long time. She was not a woman who let herself get dramatically undone by cruelty. She had developed, over the years, a particular tolerance for it, the kind that looks like strength because the alternative is being in pain every day. But this one had a quality to it she found harder to sit with. Not because it was crueler than other things she'd heard. Because it was so accurate about what people believed, even the people who thought they were wishing her well. They believed she was the sensible choice because she would not want too much. Because she could be counted on not to expect love, not to expect romance, not to expect anything beyond the reasonable exchange of labor and company. She wondered if they were right. Not about Silas. She had let herself past that doubt, or mostly past it. But about her own expectations. Had she wanted too much? Had she allowed herself over these months to expect more than a woman like her was supposed to expect? And then she heard herself thinking a woman like her and stopped cold. That phrase. She had not known it was in her, had not known she had been carrying that assessment of herself, had believed she was beyond it, had believed she had some fundamental dignity that had not been touched by 31 years of being seen as useful first and human second. And here it was, living in her own thinking, a woman like her. She was angry in a way she hadn't expected. Not at Delia Barnes, who was precisely the kind of woman Silas had described. Not cruel, just incapable of seeing outside the frame she'd been handed. Not at her mother, or the women at the general store, or Eleanor Brierly with her patting hand. The anger was more specific and more difficult than that. It was directed, at least partly, inward, at the version of herself that had absorbed the long, slow lesson so completely that she could think a woman like her about herself without flinching. She walked to his homestead that afternoon without planning to, which was becoming a pattern she recognized. He was finishing the last section of terracing. He looked up when she came across the field and read her face in the way he had gotten accurate at, and straightened and waited. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Okay." "I'm angry." He nodded. "I can see that." "At me?" "No. I don't know. Everything." She stood at the edge of the terracing and looked at the shaped ground, the weeks of work laid into it, and tried to find the words for something she was only just understanding herself. "People think you chose me because I won't expect much, because I've had a hard life and I'll be grateful, and I'll work hard, and I won't ask for anything beyond the practical." He didn't say anything. "And the part that's making me angry," she said, "is that I think some part of me believed them. Not about you. I mean about myself. That I shouldn't expect much. That love, the real kind, the kind where you're chosen because of who you are and not because of what you can do. I'd let myself believe that was for other women, not for me." She stopped. She had not planned to say all of that. She was not sure she had ever said anything quite that honest out loud to anyone. Silas was quiet for a moment. The March wind moved between them, not cold anymore, but not warm yet, the in-between kind. I think, he said slowly, that the people who built that story about you, the useful one, the practical one, the one who won't expect much, I think they built it because it was convenient for them, not because it's true. It became true, she said. That's what I'm telling you. It became true because I let it. Then stop letting it. She looked at him. I know it's not simple, he said. I'm not saying it's simple, but you're standing here telling me you've decided to be angry about it, which means something's changed from yesterday. Keep changing. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 31 years of making herself smaller in spaces that hadn't been designed to hold her. She thought about her father saying, "What would we do without you?" and meaning it as praise. She thought about the gray ribbon he'd brought her because it matched her eyes, and the way he'd stated it plainly, as a fact worth stating. She thought about a woman like her and how she was going to work, now that she knew it was in there, on getting it out. Okay, she said. It was becoming her word for him. Her word for the moment when she decided to step forward instead of back. Okay, he agreed. And then she said something she had not planned. It came out the way true things sometimes do, without construction, without the careful shaping she usually applied to vulnerable things. I don't want to be your practical choice, she said. I want to be your first choice. Not because you couldn't do better, but because there is no better. Because you see me and you choose me, and that's the whole of it. The wind moved again. A crow called somewhere behind the barn. Marin, he said, there's never been another choice. I don't know how to say it in a way that gets all the way through to the part of you that keeps not hearing it, but there it is. I'll keep saying it until you believe it. She breathed, in and out. The March air, still with the ghost of winter in it. Okay, she said, for the third time, and this time it went all the way down. Fall. April moved toward May, and May opened into the long, clear days of early summer, and the Ashcroft family began to understand, without Marin telling them directly, that something permanent was taking shape. Her father had invited Silas to the ranch twice more, and each time the kitchen conversation had gone a little longer and a little further into territory that had nothing to do with land or cattle. Her mother had stopped calculating Silas's acreage and started, with obvious effort, looking at him as a man who was present rather than a problem to be assessed. Clara had taken to calling him by his first name, which in Clara's social economy was a significant marker of acceptance. And Petra, who had spent 26 years being the one everyone looked at first, had done something unexpected. She had come to find Marin one evening in late April, when the light was long and yellow and the ranch was quiet, and she had sat down on the porch step next to her older sister and been silent for a while in the way of someone who is trying to assemble something. He doesn't look at me, Petra said finally. Marin waited. I don't mean that as badly as it sounds, Petra said quickly. I'm not saying I know it's not about me. I just mean he's at the gathering last week and I walk by and he just looks past me to find you. She paused. I didn't know men did that. Marin looked at her younger sister. Beautiful, warmly unconscious of her beauty in the way some people are, in a way that made her easy to like if you weren't living in her shadow. She was not a cruel person. She had not intended to cast a shadow. He does, Marin said. You deserve it. Petra said it simply, without the performed quality of someone trying to be magnanimous. I just wanted you to know that I see it, and that I'm sorry it took me this long to see it. Marin looked at her sister. She felt the complicated press of things that had no clean resolution. The years in the shadow, the mornings she'd gotten up before anyone to start the stove while Petra slept, the times she'd sat at the far end of the table. They were real. They didn't disappear because her sister was sitting on a step in the April light trying to say something true. But they could coexist with this. She thought they could. Thank you, she said, and meant it. The harvest celebration was announced in early September, the way it was announced every year, posted at the general store, circulated by word of mouth, inevitable as the season itself. The Caldwell Flats Harvest Celebration was the social event of the autumn, held in the wide yard behind the Dallow family's property, attended by everyone within reasonable riding distance, the occasion for new dresses and old grievances and everything in between. She wore her good dress, which she had let out at the seams in the spring, and which still wasn't quite right, but was better than it had been. She braided her hair the way Clara showed her, which took 3 attempts, and produced a result that Clara declared acceptable, with the particular authority of someone who considers acceptable a meaningful endorsement. Silas met her at the gate of the Ashcroft property. He had not suggested this. It had simply happened, the way things had been simply happening between them for months, without negotiation or announcement, as though the arrangement had always been obvious. He looked at her for a moment. "You look," he started. "Don't," she said. "I wasn't going to say anything embarrassing. You were about to say something and your face was doing something while you were about to say it, and I'm not ready for that. So." He smiled and didn't say it, whatever it was, and they walked to the celebration, and she felt the thing she had been feeling since April, the thing she had stopped fighting so hard, the simple, terrifying, ordinary fact of happiness. The celebration was as it always was, loud and warm and dense with people and food, the long tables covered with the results of months of labor, the whole community gathered in the way communities gather when there's something to celebrate, and the season is changing and the work has been done. She talked to Mrs. Calloway, who was warm with her in the way she had always been warm, and to Martha Pruitt, who asked after her family, and to the Dallow daughters, who were young and bright and easy to be around. She ate more than she'd intended. She helped carry platters, and then stopped helping carry platters because Clara appeared at her elbow and said, with unusual firmness, "You are a guest tonight, not kitchen staff. Please sit down," which was so unlike Clara that it startled her into actually sitting down. Silas was nearby, talking to her father and one of the Dallow men about cattle prices, and the sight of them together, her father and the man who had chosen her, caught in her chest in a way she hadn't prepared for. And then Harold Finch called across the gathering. He was 3 tables away and had clearly had more cider than was entirely advisable, and he had the look of a man who believes he is being entertaining when he says, at a volume that carries, "Mercer, I see you've got your help with you tonight." The particular quality of the silence that followed a bad joke. The kind where people aren't sure yet if they should laugh or pretend they didn't hear. But Harold was not finished. Harold, in the way of men who have committed to a bit and cannot locate the exit, continued, "A plain wife's the best kind for a working man, eh? No complaints about your long hours, no fuss about the house not being fine enough. A good workhorse doesn't ask for much." He grinned and looked around for the appreciation he expected, and found it from 2 men nearby who offered the uncomfortable half-laughs of people who want to be liked by Harold Finch. The silence after those laughs was different from the silence before them. Sharper, with a texture to it. Maren set down her cup, very carefully. She was not surprised. She recognized this moment, had felt it building, if she were honest, not just tonight but across the whole of this year, the slow accumulation of every kindly meant reduction, every approving comment that reduced her to her capacity for labor, every warm smile delivered while she was being made smaller. She had been waiting, she understood now, for the moment when all of it would land in one place at one time, when there would finally be a single identifiable thing to answer instead of a diffuse and sourceless wait. Silas had already turned toward Harold Finch. She could see it in the set of his shoulders. The particular stillness before a man who is capable of controlled anger exercises that control. But something stopped her from letting him speak first. It was not the anger. She had expected the anger and had felt it coming. It was something underneath the anger, something older and calmer, and in some ways fiercer. The part of her that had spent 31 years absorbing and enduring and accommodating and making things easier for everyone around her, and had decided, somewhere between January and now, in increments too small to name individually but unmistakable in total, that it was finished. She stood up. Not dramatically. She did not push her chair back with a sound or rise to her full height with any particular intention of looking tall. She simply stood up, in the ordinary way a person stands, and the movement was quiet enough that only the people immediately around her noticed immediately, but notice spread. The way notice spreads through a gathering, person to person, the slight shift of attention, the turning of faces. Harold Finch saw her standing and had the grace to look uncertain. "Mr. Finch," she said. Her voice was level. It was not loud. She didn't raise it, didn't need to, because the quiet that had descended was deep enough that a level voice carried far. "I've heard that word," she said. "Workhorse. I've heard it in different forms from different people for most of my life. I'm aware it's generally meant as a compliment." Harold opened his mouth. I'm not finished, she said. He closed it. I am proud of the work I've done, she said. I'm proud of every fence I've mended and every row I've planted and every morning I got up before anyone else to keep things running. I'm proud of my calluses and I'm not ashamed of any of it. She paused. But I am not a workhorse. I am a woman. And I will not stand here and let anyone, no matter how kindly they mean it, define my value by what I can produce. The gathering was very still. She looked at Harold Finch and then looked past him, around the tables, at the faces she had known most of her life. The ones who had always been kind, the ones who had not meant any harm, the ones who had managed to overlook her for 30 years while being perfectly pleasant about it. I spent a long time believing I was supposed to be grateful for being chosen, she said. Grateful for being called useful. Grateful for being noticed at all. I was wrong. She looked at Silas briefly and then back at the gathering. I was not chosen because I'm practical. I was chosen because someone decided to actually look. And I'm telling you now, not angrily, not to shame anyone. I'm telling you because it needs to be said, I deserve to be looked at. Not my labor, me. The silence after she stopped speaking had a quality she had never felt the center of before. It was the silence of a room in which something true has been said, and everyone in the room knows it is true, and nobody is entirely sure what to do with that. Harold Finch looked at his boots. He did not say anything. Whatever he had meant to follow his joke with had apparently departed. Silas was looking at her the way he always looked at her when she did something that surprised him. The recognition, the thing she had finally found a name for. It was simply this. He looked at her the way you look at someone who has always been exactly who they are and who you have never, not once, wished were different. She sat back down. She picked up her cup. Her hands were not entirely steady, which she found annoying, but she kept them around the cup and let nobody see. Clara's hand found hers under the table and pressed once, quickly. Across the table, her father was looking at her. She met his eyes, which she did not always do, and she saw in them something she had not seen directed at her before, or not that she could remember. Not approval exactly, not pride exactly, but a kind of reckoning. The face of a man who is in the process of understanding something he should have understood a long time ago. He looked away first. She let him. The celebration resumed, the way things resume after the significant moment passes and life determines to continue regardless. Conversations restarted. Someone began to play a fiddle somewhere near the far end of the yard. The food continued to be eaten, and the cider continued to circulate, and Harold Finch found some business to attend to that took him away from his table. But something had changed in the air, the way air changes after a storm that is finally, after days of pressure building, broken. She felt it against her skin. The change. Silas came and sat beside her a few minutes later and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. And then more truthfully, "I don't know. Ask me later." He nodded. He stayed beside her, and she let the celebration continue around her, and she sat in the strange new space of a woman who has said a true thing out loud in a room full of people and cannot take it back, and when she examined herself honestly, did not want to. She had been afraid of needing too much, of wanting more than she was allowed. She had been afraid of getting this wrong, of building something and then finding the ground under it. She was still afraid. She thought she might always be a little afraid, because the fear was not irrational. It was the reasonable residue of living in a world that had not always been careful with her. But she was sitting at a table in the September evening with the fiddle playing and the harvest smell in the air, and the man who had chosen her sitting beside her, and she was, underneath everything, entirely herself. That was new. That was the thing she had not quite had before. Not the man, not the relationship, not any of it. Just this. Herself. And the knowledge that herself was enough. And the willingness to ask that the people in her life treat it accordingly. She looked at the September sky, still light at the edges, going dark toward the middle. She had always loved this hour, the long hold before full dark, the way the world waited. She was still waiting too. She knew that. There was still the conversation with her father that hadn't happened yet. Still the future to build and the ground to work, and the ways this new version of herself would be tested by ordinary life, which was always more demanding than dramatic moments because it had no end and no audience. But she was not afraid of it tonight. Tonight she was only here, at this table, in this light, at the edge of everything that was about to change. The morning after the harvest celebration, Caldwell Flats woke up and did what small communities always do after something significant has happened in their midst. It talked about it. Not all of them had been there for Marin's words, but by mid-morning the account had traveled through enough kitchens and over enough fence lines that the general shape of the event was known, if not always accurately rendered in the retelling. She knew this because Clara told her. Clara, who had a gift for intelligence gathering that she deployed with the cheerful efficiency of someone who considers information a social currency, came to find Marin in the kitchen garden the next morning with a particular expression, the one that meant she had things to report and was deciding how to report them. "People are talking," Clara said, which was not news. "About last night," Marin said, which was also not news. "Mrs. Barnes said you were very brave." Clara paused. She also said it was a shame you had to say it at all, but the brave part she said first. Marin pulled a late-season weed from between the onion rows and didn't answer. Mr. Pruitt said Harold Finch deserved worse. Clara crouched down at the edge of the garden in a way that suggested she was not actually going to help with the weeding but wanted to be close enough for the conversation. "Papa didn't say anything at breakfast, which I think means something, but I don't know what." Marin knew what. She had been thinking about her father since she woke up, in the careful, circling way she thought about things that didn't yet have a clear shape. He had looked at her across that table last night with an expression she had never seen him turn toward her, and then looked away, and neither of them had spoken before she and Silas left the celebration together in the late evening. The unspoken thing had followed her home and was still in the house this morning, sitting in the kitchen the way Edmund Ashcroft sat at the kitchen table, solid and unmoving and present whether or not anyone addressed it directly. "Where is he now?" Marin asked. "Barn." She stood up, brushed the dirt from her hands, and went to the barn. Her father was repairing a bridle, which he did not need to be doing at this hour, but which gave his hands something to do, and she understood that about him because she was more like him than either of them had ever said out loud. He heard her come in and did not look up immediately, in the way of a man who needs an extra moment to arrange himself before a difficult conversation. She sat down on the low stool near the workbench. She did not say anything. She had inherited from him, or learned from long proximity, the understanding that some conversations need to start on their own rather than being forced open. He worked on the bridle for a while. She waited. "I heard what you said last night," he said finally. Most people did. He was quiet again. His hands kept working. She watched his profile, the deep lines of it, the weathered skin, the particular set of his jaw that meant he was thinking through something he did not find comfortable. "You were talking about us," he said, "not just Finch." "Yes." He set the bridle down. He looked at his hands for a moment, then at her, and she held the look because she was done being the one who looked away first. "I didn't know you felt—" He stopped, started again. "I thought you were all right. You never said anything." "No," she said. "I didn't." "Why didn't you—" "Because you never asked." She kept her voice even. Not cold. She didn't want cold. Cold was the other side of the same problem, the one where you protect yourself from feeling something by making sure nobody else can feel anything either. She wanted something more honest than cold. And because by the time I understood what was missing, it seemed too late to ask for it. And because I was afraid that if I asked and you couldn't give it, that would be worse than not asking. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her last night, that reckoning. She could see it costing him something, and she found, unexpectedly, that she did not want to watch it cost him too much. She loved her father. That was the thing that made this difficult in both directions. She was not estranged from him, had not been treated cruelly, did not have a clean narrative of wrongdoing that would have been, in some ways, easier to carry. What she had was more complicated. A good man who had a blind spot shaped exactly like her, and 15 years of mourning she had gotten up early to start the stove while he was still asleep. "I did it too," she said, and watched him look up. "I made myself useful so I wouldn't have to ask for anything, so I could earn my place without requiring it. That was my part in it. I'm not putting all of this on you." "It was my job," he said, in a low voice that had something rough in it she hadn't heard before. "To look, to see you. That was my job, and I—" He stopped. He picked up the bridle again and then put it back down. "I was grateful for you every day, Marin. I want you to know that. I said it wrong and I said it too little, but it was true." "I know," she said. "I know it was true." That's not the same as feeling it. He nodded. He looked like a man who has just understood for the first time the difference between those two things and the full weight of that difference. What do you need from me? He said. Now. What do you need? She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about things that mattered. I need you to see me, she said. Not what I can do, not what I contribute, me. I need to know you'd love me if I stopped being useful tomorrow. His face did something that men of his generation and his particular stoicism did not often allow their faces to do. It cracked, just slightly, at the edges. I would, he said. Marin, of course I would. Okay, she said. I'm sorry, he said. For whatever that's worth. It's worth something, she said. It's worth enough. She did not hug him. They were not that kind of family, had never been that kind of family, and manufacturing a tenderness that didn't fit them both would have been its own kind of dishonesty. She stood up, and he sat there at the workbench, and they looked at each other for a moment in the dusty September light of the barn, and something that had been unresolved between them for 15 years moved, slowly, in the direction of settlement. Not resolved. She was honest with herself about that. An apology did not reconstruct what had not been built, but it was a beginning, and she had learned this past year to recognize beginnings for what they were. She went back out to her garden. She finished pulling the weeds. The morning was clear and cool and smelled like turned earth, which she had always loved. Silas came 2 days later. He had given her the space of those 2 days without being told to, which by now she had stopped being surprised by and had started simply being grateful for. He came in the late afternoon when the light was going amber, and she met him at the gate the way she'd started doing, and they walked toward the creek without deciding to, which had become their default. How are you? He asked. Better than I expected, she said. Worse than I hoped. How's your father? Thinking. She turned a stone with her boot as they walked. He's a slow thinker, my father. Deliberate. He doesn't do anything fast except work. She paused. He apologized. Silas looked at her. It didn't fix anything, she said, but it was real. I think it was real. Good apologies usually are, he said. The bad ones feel better in the moment and worse later. The real ones are uncomfortable for everybody. She thought about that. He asked what I needed. What did you say? To be seen, not my labor. She glanced at him. He said he would. He meant it. I don't know yet whether meaning it is enough to make it happen, but... She shrugged. He's never promised me anything he didn't try to keep. That's worth something. They walked in silence for a moment, the good kind, the kind she no longer felt she had to fill. Marin, he said. Something in the way he said it, just her name, but with a particular weight to it, the weight of something that has been carried a while and is about to be set down, made her slow slightly. I have something I want to ask you, he said. And I want to say something first before I ask it, because I've been thinking about how to say this for a while and I want to get it right. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. The creek was audible nearby, low from the summer but still running, and the cottonwoods were deep into their autumn yellow. I'm not going to tell you I'll give you everything, he said, because I don't know what everything is, and I'd be lying if I said I did. I'm going to tell you what I know, which is that I have been building something out here for over a year, and every time I thought about what I was building it for, not the land, not the homestead, what it was actually for, I thought about the same thing. He paused. You, at my table. Not cooking at my stove. Not mending my shirts. Sitting at my table, telling me what you think about something, being there when I come in at the end of a day. He looked at her. I'm asking you to marry me. Not because this land is hard and I need the labor, because I cannot think about the future without you in it, and I've tried, and it doesn't work. The cottonwood leaves moved above them. A kingfisher went over the creek in a streak of blue. She had thought, when this moment came, she had known it was coming, had felt it approaching for months the way you feel a change in weather, that she would need time even then, that the habits of caution she had spent a lifetime building would reassert themselves at the last moment, would make her slow even here, even now. She did not need time. Yes, she said. Not okay. Yes. The word she had been withholding all her life from anything that asked too much of her, the word that meant she was all the way in, the word that had always felt dangerous because it closed off the retreat she had spent 31 years maintaining. Yes. He looked at her for a moment as though confirming she'd said what he'd heard. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and brought out a ring. Simple, silver, with a small dark stone that was the color of the creek water in certain light, and held it out in the unsentimental way of a man who has thought about this considerably and is not going to perform the thinking. "It was my grandmother's," he said. "She was a woman who knew her own mind. I thought it suited." She took it. She turned it once in her fingers. The stone caught the afternoon light. "It suits," she said. She put it on herself. Her hands, with their calluses and their short practical nails, and this ring that had belonged to a woman she'd never meet, who had known her own mind, it looked right. She had expected it to look incongruous, had expected to feel like someone trying on something that belonged to a different kind of woman. It looked right. She held her hand out so they could both look at it. He looked at it and then at her. "We should tell your father," he said. "We should," she agreed. "That will be a conversation." "I can handle a conversation." "You haven't had this particular one." "How bad is it likely to be?" She considered. "He likes you. He's not going to be opposed. But he's going to ask you questions about the land and the finances and your plans for the next 10 years, and it's going to last at least 2 hours and involve a great deal of coffee." Silas appeared undaunted by this. "I can handle coffee. And my mother is going to immediately begin planning a wedding that is 3 times the size of anything either of us want. We'll handle it together." She looked at him. The late afternoon light was in his face, and she looked at him the way she had been slowly learning to look at things she wanted, directly, without flinching, without the apologetic sideways glance that implied she was taking up too much by looking at all. "Together," she said. Edmund Ashcroft's conversation with Silas Mercer lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes, and involved 4 cups of coffee, and as predicted, detailed questions about the land, the finances, and the plan for the next decade. Ruth Ashcroft appeared in the kitchen 20 minutes in, having apparently found some business there that required her presence, and stayed for the remainder of the conversation in the way of a woman who was technically in the background and practically very much not. Clara was transparently delighted. Petra hugged Marin in the front hallway with a warmth that surprised them both. Her father, at the end of the 2 hours and 40 minutes, shook Silas's hand and held it a moment longer than a standard handshake and said, "Take care of her." And Silas, who had a gift for the precise response, said, "She doesn't need taking care of. She needs someone to stand beside her while she does what she's always done." Her father looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Marin. Then he nodded, slowly, in the way of a man who has just had something explained to him that he should have understood a long time ago, and is deciding not to argue with the timeline. "Supper next Sunday," he said. "Both of you." That was the blessing, Ashcroft style. No ceremony, just Sunday supper. They were married in November, just before the cold came in hard. Not a large wedding. Marin had stood firm on that, which had required 2 significant conversations with her mother, and 1 minor standoff involving the question of whether the Dallow family needed to be formally invited or could simply be told, but she held the line. Small, simple. The people who mattered, and not the people who would come for the spectacle. It was held at the Ashcroft Ranch because the cabin wasn't large enough and wasn't finished enough. And because, Silas said, this part was for her family to witness, and her family's home was the right place for it. She had not expected to care about this kind of thing. She discovered she cared more than she'd anticipated, not for the ceremony itself, but for what it meant. The public witnessed acknowledgement that she was someone who had a life, a real one, that warranted witnessing. She wore her mother's dress, let out, and altered to fit her frame, which was not her mother's frame. Ruth had done the alterations herself, taking 3 evenings to do it, and on the 3rd evening Marin had stood in the kitchen while her mother pinned and fitted, and neither of them said anything for a long time, and then her mother said quietly, to the fabric rather than to Marin, "I should have asked more questions." Marin looked at the top of her mother's head, bent over the hem. "You should have," she said. Not cruelly, just true. "I know what I did," Ruth said. "I counted on you, and I didn't wonder how it felt to be counted on all the time. I thought you were happy that way, that some people are, and you were one of them." "I wasn't." "I know." Her mother's hand stilled for a moment on the fabric. "You're my daughter, Marin. Whatever I did wrong, you're my daughter, and I love you. I'm not good at saying that, and I'm sorry for that too." She had not cried. She had gotten better at not crying at things she'd needed to cry at for years, which was either progress or a problem. She wasn't entirely sure. She had put her hand on her mother's shoulder, briefly, and her mother had put her hand over hers, and they had stood there for a moment in the kitchen that Marin had cooked in for 15 years. And then her mother had gone back to pinning the hem, and they had talked about nothing important for the rest of the evening, and it had been, somehow, the most honest conversation they had ever had. The wedding morning was cold and clear. She got up before anyone, because she always got up before anyone, and she stood at the kitchen window in her mother's house for the last time, and watched the early light change over the flat land and felt the particular quality of the half hour she had always called hers. It was the same, and it was not the same. It belonged to her the same way it always had, but she was different inside it. She did not feel transformed. She had expected to feel something dramatic, and felt instead something smaller and more permanent than dramatic, a kind of settling. The sense of being, at last, in the right place, even though the right place was still complicated and imperfect, and surrounded by people who had all hurt her in the small, ordinary ways that people hurt each other when they're not paying attention. Clara brought her coffee and sat with her at the kitchen table in the quiet, and they didn't talk much, and it was the best hour Clara had ever given her. The ceremony itself was brief and plain, and had a moment in it that she had not expected. When the judge, a broad-shouldered man named Holloway, who had been doing these ceremonies for 30 years, and had the practiced ease of someone who has said the same words enough times that they've stopped being words and have become simply sounds he makes. When Judge Holloway got to the part where he asked if anyone had cause to object, there was the standard silence that always follows that question, the silence that is more habit than expectation. And into that silence, Harold Finch, who had been invited because he was Harold Finch and excluding him would have created more trouble than including him, Harold Finch said, not to object, but apparently compelled by some force he could not resist. "She's a fine woman, Mercer. You've done well." Several things happened at once. Clara's jaw tightened. Petra closed her eyes. Silas turned his head slightly in Harold Finch's direction with an expression that could have cut glass. And Marin, standing in her mother's altered dress with the dark stone ring already on her hand, looked at Harold Finch with the full weight of a woman who has recently discovered what it feels like to speak the truth in a room full of people and survived it, and said pleasantly, "Thank you, Harold. Now hush." Laughter broke through the gathering like something that had been held and suddenly released. Even Judge Holloway, in his 30 years of ceremonies, allowed himself a brief but genuine smile. Harold Finch sat down with the expression of a man who has been gently and completely handled and is aware of it. Silas looked at her with the recognition she had learned to read clearly, and she looked back at him with what she imagined was a similar expression, and Judge Holloway pronounced them married, and that was that. The cabin was cold when they arrived back to it that evening. It always took time to warm, being new and still settling, the walls not yet entirely true to each other. She started the stove while he brought in the firewood, and they moved around the small space with the particular ease of two people who have been learning each other's rhythms for over a year. And she thought how strange it was, that this space was now hers in a way no space had ever been hers before. Not her family's space she occupied, not a space she'd earned by making herself useful in it. Hers. She put the kettle on, and Silas hung his coat on the hook he'd put in the wall for that purpose, and she stood at the stove with her hand on the kettle and looked around the room. The uneven table, the mismatched chairs, the bookshelf he'd built that was almost plumb but not entirely, the book about the ocean on the shelf beside two others she'd brought, and felt, in a way she hadn't felt since she was very small, before she'd learned to be careful about such things, entirely at home. "You're looking at something," he said. "Everything," she said. He came to stand beside her at the stove, not crowding her, just present, in the way he was always present, without demand. She leaned into him, just slightly, the way you lean into something solid when you've been standing for a long time. "Okay?" he said. "Yes," she said. The real yes. The one she'd been learning to mean all year. They had tea. They talked about small things, the east field, the winter preparations, whether the roof on the north side of the barn extension needed attention before the snow. These were the conversations of two people who have a life together and are attending to it, and she loved them, these conversations, for exactly what they were. Not romantic, not elevated, just real. Just the texture of an actual shared life rather than the idea of one. Late in the evening, when the fire had settled and the cabin had warmed to something livable, she pulled out the letter she'd been writing in pieces for 2 weeks and never finished. It was to no one in particular. She had started it as a kind of clarification for herself, a way of understanding what the past year had been. She read the last line she'd written, which was, "I spent 31 years believing that being loved was something you earned by being useful, and I'm still not entirely over that, and I suspect I won't be for a long time, and I am deciding that's all right." She folded it and didn't finish it. It didn't need finishing. The first time her family came to supper at the cabin was a Sunday in late November, 3 weeks after the wedding. All of them, her father and mother, Clara and Petra, and her father's brother Thomas, who was visiting from further west, and had the kind of natural ease that made him welcome in any room without particularly trying. She had cooked. She had wanted to cook, not because it was expected or because she was demonstrating something, but because she was good at it and she enjoyed it, and this was her kitchen, and she could do what she wanted in it. She had made the things she was best at: a pot roast that needed the whole day, bread that had been rising since morning, a dried apple cake that was her grandmother's recipe, and the only recipe she had never shared with anyone because it was hers. The cabin was warm and loud in a way it had never been, voices filling the rooms that had always been quiet, her father's solid presence at the table, her mother looking around at everything with an expression Marin recognized as genuine rather than performative interest, Clara talking to Silas with the bright efficiency of a young woman who has decided she likes someone and is proceeding accordingly. Petra was quiet in the comfortable way Petra sometimes was when she didn't need to perform her beauty, when she was simply a young woman at a table, eating good food, being somewhere that didn't require her to be anything in particular. Marin carried the pot roast to the table. She set it down. She went back for the bread. She was reaching for the bread knife when she noticed that people were already reaching for the pot roast. Her father's hand moving toward the serving fork, her mother cutting into the bread, the habitual reaching that happens when food appears and hunger is present. And Silas, who was at the far end of the table, said, quietly but clearly, "Hold on." It was not loud. It was not harsh. It was the voice of a man who means a small thing and means it completely. Everyone stopped. Not dramatically, just the natural pause of people who have been asked to stop. "Marin," he said, and looked at her. She looked back at him. "Sit down," he said. She understood in that moment what he was doing, and she felt something move through her that she didn't have a clean word for. Not exactly gratitude, not exactly love, not exactly grief for all the meals before this one. Something that contained all three and was larger than all three. She put down the bread knife. She walked around the table to her chair, the good chair, the one she'd picked, at the side of the table nearest the window where the light was best, and she sat down. The table was still. Her mother had withdrawn her hand from the bread. Her father was sitting with the serving fork he'd picked up back on the table in front of him. Clara was looking between Silas and Marin with wide eyes. Even Thomas, who had no particular context for this moment, seemed to sense the weight of it. "Thank you," Silas said simply, and that was all. Then he began serving, standing up, going around the table the way a host goes, making sure everyone had what they needed before he sat down himself. And when everyone had food, and he sat down, he looked at Marin, and she looked at him, and the table began to eat. Her mother did not say anything for a moment. Then she picked up her fork and said very quietly, to no one in particular, "This smells wonderful." Her father looked at Marin across the table. It was the same look she had seen in the barn that September morning. The reckoning, the understanding, the thing that was arriving late and knew it was arriving late and was coming anyway. He held her eyes for a moment, and in his face she could see him seeing her, actually seeing her, in the way she had needed him to see her for 15 years. He nodded. A small thing. The kind of nod that in Edmund Ashcroft's economy of expression was the equivalent of a longer speech. She nodded back. Claire was watching all of this with a face that was doing too many things at once, and she appeared to decide that the safest response was to take a large bite of pot roast and make a sound of appreciation that was entirely genuine and slightly overdone, and Petra laughed at that, and Thomas said something to her father about the land that drew the conversation sideways, and the meal continued in the warm and complicated way of family meals that carry more history than the table can hold and manage anyway. She sat at her table in her cabin and ate the food she had cooked in her kitchen and listened to her family filling the rooms she now lived in, and she was not entirely at peace. She was too honest with herself for that kind of simplicity, too aware of the unfinished work in most of her relationships, too acquainted with her own complicated feelings to pretend they had resolved cleanly. She was not at peace, but she was present, fully, without the part of herself that was always slightly elsewhere, slightly held back, slightly waiting to be needed so she could justify her presence. She was simply there, at the table, in her life, as herself. The cake came out well. It always did. It was the one thing she never had to worry about, the one recipe that had never once let her down. She served it herself, because she wanted to, and her father took the first bite and looked at her and said, "This is the same as your grandmother's." "It is," she said. She would have liked this, he said, meaning the cabin, or the marriage, or the evening. She wasn't sure which, and thought it might be all three. "I hope so," she said. Outside, the November wind was building towards something that would probably be the first real snow by morning. Inside, the stove kept the room warm, and the lamp kept it bright, and the people she had loved her entire life, imperfectly and with complicated history and without clean resolution, sat at her table and ate her food and stayed. She had spent 31 years waiting to be someone's first choice. She was not going to spend another year waiting for anything. The snow came that night, as she had expected. She lay in the dark, listening to it settle against the cabin walls. A different sound than snow against her childhood bedroom, lighter somehow, or maybe she was just listening differently now, and felt the winter arrive around the life she had chosen. She slept well. She had been sleeping better since the wedding, which she might have expected but hadn't. There was something about being in the right place that the body recognized before the mind caught up to it, some deep animal knowledge of safety that expressed itself in uninterrupted sleep, and mornings she woke before the alarm of habit rather than anxiety. Silas was already up when she opened her eyes. She could hear him at the stove, the particular sounds of his morning, the way he set the kettle down slightly harder than necessary, the creak of the third floorboard from the wall that he kept meaning to fix and hadn't. She lay still for a moment and listened to those sounds and thought, this is what it is. Not extraordinary, not the version from the novels she'd read. Just this. A man making coffee badly in the next room in the early dark of a November morning, and her lying here listening, and both of them exactly where they meant to be. She got up. The first winter of their marriage was hard in the way that first winters always are. Not cruel, just unrelenting. The snow that arrived in November stayed through February, not constantly but in layers, each storm adding to what the last had left, the land becoming something monochrome and enormous and demanding. The homestead was still new enough that there were things that didn't work right in the cold, things that needed discovering the hard way. A water line that froze in a January snap, a section of the barn extension that leaked where the roof joined the old structure, two of the new animals that required more attention through the winter than they had budgeted for. She was not a woman who needed things to be easy. She had made her peace with hard long before she'd made her peace with much else. What she found, that first winter, was not that the work was less than she'd expected, but that it felt different, which was something she had not quite anticipated. She had worked hard all her life. She had worked at the Ashcroft Ranch for 15 years with her back and her hands and her attention, and it had sustained everyone around her and worn her thin in ways she hadn't admitted until she was past them. She worked just as hard at the Mercer homestead, harder in some ways, because everything was new, and a new homestead demands everything you have and then asks for a little more. But it was hers. The labor was hers because the land was hers, the future was hers. And the man she was working beside was beside her rather than ahead of her, or above her, or simply taking what she provided without turning to see who was providing it. She drove fence posts in the January cold, and her arms ached and her hands went numb, and she felt the particular satisfaction of a thing she had chosen because she had chosen it. That was the difference. She had figured it out by February. It was the choice. She had always worked. She would always work. She was not a woman who would ever be otherwise, and she no longer believed she was supposed to want to be. But the work you choose and the work you do, because you have made yourself so necessary to others that they no longer see you as separate from the function you perform, those are not the same thing, and the difference lives in the body. It lived in hers. Her father came in March, on a Thursday, without her mother or her sisters. He rode out alone on a morning that was beginning to think about being spring without fully committing to it. The ground still hard, but the sky a different color than it had been in January. She saw him coming from the kitchen window and went outside to meet him. He tied his horse at the post and stood looking at the homestead for a moment. The terraced east slope, the repaired barn extension, the kitchen garden beds turned and ready for planting, the cabin with its imperfectly seated porch door and the smoke coming from the chimney. He looked at all of it the way he had always looked at land, honestly, with attention, without sentiment. "You've done a lot," he said. "We've done a lot," she said. He came inside and drank coffee with her and Silas, and the conversation went in the careful, mostly practical direction that conversations with Edmund Ashcroft always went. But she noticed something different in him that morning. He asked Silas about the East Slope Terrace with the genuine interest of a man who has farmed difficult ground and wants to understand how someone else is approaching it. He asked Maren about the kitchen garden with the specific, detailed questions of someone who is actually listening rather than being polite. And at one point, when she said something about her plan for the spring planting, a rotation she'd been thinking about through the winter, worked out on paper over several evenings, he sat back and looked at her and said, "Where did you learn to think about it that way?" "From you," she said, "and from doing it myself for 15 years. He was quiet for a moment. "I never let you change much. At the ranch." "No. You had ideas." "Yes. I should have let you try them." He said it to the table, not to her, the way he said things that were hard. I thought I was protecting the operation, keeping things reliable." "You were," she said, "and it kept me from knowing what I was capable of." He looked at her then. "What are you capable of?" She thought about the terracing that was going to save the East Slope's moisture through the summer, the rotation plan that she had designed from scratch and would test in a few weeks, the way she had problem-solved the frozen water line in January at 6 in the morning before Silas had even woken up because she had seen the signs and caught it early. "More than anyone thought," she said, "including me." He left an hour later and stopped at his horse and turned back once, the way he did when he had something more to say and was deciding. "Your grandmother," he said, "my mother. She was like you." She waited. "I think I was afraid you'd leave if I encouraged it," he said. "The way she left." He paused. "She should have. She needed more than we could give her." She stood on the porch of her own cabin and looked at her father in the thin March light and understood, for the first time, something about him that she had not had the information to understand before. He was not simply a man with a blind spot. He was a man who had learned to hold on to necessary things through a particular method that had worked until it hadn't, and had not known how to change it, and had passed some of that fear sideways onto her without knowing he was doing it. She did not forgive him in a flash of feeling, the way the novels would have had it. She had already mostly forgiven him through the slow, undramatic process of choosing to build her own life rather than continue to define herself against the one she'd had. What she felt in that moment was something more like understanding. And understanding is sometimes better than forgiveness because it requires you to see a person whole, not just the parts of them that hurt you. "She didn't leave because she was encouraged," Maren said. "She left because she had to. That's different." He looked at her steadily. "I know," he said. "I know that now." He rode back toward the ranch and she watched him go and then went back inside to her kitchen and her coffee and the planting plan spread out on the table and the sound of Silas coming in from the barn. "How was that?" he asked. "Hard," she said. "And good, mostly in that order." He poured himself coffee and looked at her planting plan over her shoulder. "You changed the north bed. I think it gets better morning light than I initially mapped it." "You're probably right," he said, and sat down across from her, and they went back to the plan. Spring arrived the way it always arrived on the plains, reluctantly and then all at once. One week the ground was still iron, and the next it was giving under her boots, and the smell of it was different, the alive smell, and she felt the particular impatience of a gardener looking at ground that is almost ready. She planted the kitchen garden first, the way she always had, because the kitchen garden was about feeding people now, not about the future, and feeding people now was never something she was willing to postpone. Then the East Slope, following the rotation plan she'd spent the winter designing. Then the long field south of the barn, which Silas worked with her, the two of them going down the rows in a rhythm they had found early and kept. She was bent over a row of young seedlings in late April, doing the fine work of thinning them, the necessary cruelty of gardening, pulling the excess so the remaining plants had room to become what they needed to be. When she became aware, with the sudden clarity of a thing your body knows before your mind does, that she was not just one person in the garden, she stayed crouched over the seedlings for a long moment. The morning light was on the east slope, the terraced east slope that she had designed and Silas had built, and that was already showing what it could do when the water moved right. The seedlings were green and small and full of what they were going to become. She put her hand flat on the turned earth, the way she had always put her hand on earth she was tending. Listening, she supposed, though she had never used that word for it out loud. Then she stood up and went inside. She told Silas that evening after supper, in the middle of washing the dishes, because that was when she told him things. Not at staged moments, but in the middle of the ordinary, because that was when things were most real. She said it plainly, the way she'd learned to say true things. I think I'm going to have a baby. He was at the table with the account book he kept on Fridays, and he stopped writing, and he looked at her, and his face did the thing it sometimes did when something mattered more than he knew how to immediately express. Went still, the stillness of deep water rather than frozen water. You think? He said. I'm fairly certain, she said. I've been paying attention to my body for 32 years. I think I know. He set down the pencil. He pushed back from the table and came and stood beside her at the basin, and she kept washing the dishes because she needed to do something with her hands. And he stood there, and after a moment he put his hand over hers, the one holding the dish, and just held it. Are you scared? He asked. Yes, she said. You? Considerably, he said. She turned and looked at him. Good, she said. Scared means we understand what it is. He laughed. The real one, the quiet one. She went back to the dishes, and he stayed beside her, and they did not talk for a while, and the evening moved around them, the way evenings do, ordinary and irreplaceable. She told her mother before she told anyone else in the family. She went to the ranch on a Tuesday morning and found Ruth in the kitchen and told her directly, without preamble, the way she had been learning to say things since last September, without apology, without the performance of uncertainty. Her mother's face, in the moment of hearing it, was something she had never seen before and would not forget. It was not the practical expression, the assessing one, the one that came with the silent calculation of what this would mean and what would be required. It was just her mother's face, open for a moment before everything else. Oh, Ruth said, just that. And then she pulled Marin into a hug that was nothing like her usual careful, brief embraces. It was the hug of a woman who has been holding something back for a long time and has finally found the occasion to release it. And Marin stood in her mother's arms in the kitchen she had cooked in for 15 years and felt complicated and whole, the love that had always been there in the wrong form. She cried. She had told herself sometime around February that she was going to stop fighting the urge to cry at things that deserved crying at. It was not weakness, it was honesty. She cried briefly into her mother's shoulder, and her mother held her and didn't say anything practical, which was its own kind of gift. The baby was a boy. He arrived in December, on a cold night that was not the worst kind of cold, not the killing kind, just the serious kind, the kind that keeps the air clear and the stars visible. He arrived, as babies do, at the exact moment that was most inconvenient and most perfect, and he was loud and demanding from his first moment in the world, which Silas said meant he was healthy and Marin said meant he already had opinions. They named him after no one living, which was a deliberate choice they had discussed in October and agreed on without difficulty. He was not a continuation of anyone else's story. He was his own. Edmund Silas Mercer. The Edmund was for her father because some debts are settled not by refusing to acknowledge them, but by carrying them forward into something new. Her father, when he heard the name, went out to the barn for approximately 20 minutes and came back with red eyes that he attributed to the cold, which nobody believed and nobody mentioned. Her son was 2 years old the first time he asked why everyone waited for his mother before eating. He had noticed it the way small children notice things that are consistent, not with analysis, but with the simple accumulation of observation that is how children build their understanding of how the world works. Every Sunday supper, at the Mercer homestead or at the Ashcroft Ranch, every gathering of the family, the same thing happened. The food appeared and people reached for it, and then stopped, and looked for Marin, and waited until she sat down. He had absorbed this as a fact of the world, the way he had absorbed the fact that the east slope needed more water than the south field, and that his father's coffee was bad and his mother's bread was good. He asked it at the supper table on a Sunday in spring, 3 years after the harvest celebration, where Marin had stood up in front of Caldwell Flats and said the true thing. He asked it the way children ask, without embarrassment, without subtext, with the straightforward curiosity of someone who genuinely wants to understand. Silas looked at Marin. She was looking at their son with an expression he recognized from 2 years of watching it, the one that meant she was deciding how to answer something honestly, in a way that would mean something, rather than in the easiest way. She let Silas answer, not because she didn't have the answer, but because she wanted to hear how he said it. He had earned the right to say it. Silas leaned forward on the table and looked at his son with the serious attention he gave to things that mattered. "Do you know what the first supper in our house was?" he said. The boy shook his head. "It was a long time before you were born, before your mama and I were married. She came to my cabin, which wasn't much of a cabin, I should tell you, and she brought a pie because my cooking was terrible, and she apparently didn't trust me." "Still shouldn't," Marin said without heat. "Fair," Silas agreed. "We ate supper together, and she sat at my table, and that was when I understood what home felt like. Not the cabin, her, at the table." He paused. "For a long time before that, your mother went to a lot of tables and cooked a lot of food and took care of a lot of people, and she did all that before she sat down herself, and most times she didn't get to sit down at all. And nobody noticed." The boy was watching him with the focused attention of a child who understands that something important is being explained. "So the first real supper in our house only became real when she sat down at it," Silas said. "And since then we wait, every time. Because every meal at this table starts when she's at it. Not when the food is hot. Not when everyone else is ready. When she's there." The boy thought about this for a moment. "Because she made the food?" "No," Silas said. "Not because of what she made. Because of who she is." The boy turned this over. 2 years old was too young for the full weight of it, and they both knew that, but she also believed, she had always believed, against the evidence of her own childhood, that children absorb what they are shown more than what they are told, and what he was being shown, at every Sunday table in every season, was something specific and important. He would grow up in a house where a woman sat down before the meal began, not because she had finally finished serving everyone else, but because her presence at the table was the thing that made the meal a meal. That was what she was giving him. Not a lesson. A world. "Okay," the boy said, with the simplicity of a child who has received sufficient explanation and reached for his bread. Marin looked at Silas across the table and felt the complicated layered thing that had no single name. Not happiness exactly, though it was that, not gratitude exactly, though it was that too. Something more like the recognition of rightness, the sense of a thing being what it was supposed to be, not because it was perfect, but because it was true. There is a particular kind of invisibility that has nothing to do with being unseen. Marin Ashcroft had spent 31 years being visible, present, productive, central to the functioning of everything around her, while being invisible in the way that mattered, which is to say, as a person rather than a function. She had been known without being understood. She had been needed without being chosen. She had been valuable in every calculation except the one that asks not what someone can give, but who they are when they stop giving. She understood now that she had participated in her own invisibility. Not willingly, she would not be unfair to herself about that, but practically. She had made herself indispensable because indispensability was the only form of security she had known how to build. She had not said what she wanted because wanting had felt dangerous. She had not claimed space because she had been taught, slowly and without malice, and by people who loved her imperfectly, that space was earned rather than inherent. She was still undoing that. She did not pretend otherwise. There were still mornings when she woke with the old reflex, the impulse to start calculating what needed to be done and for whom, to make herself useful before she made herself anything else. She still sometimes caught herself apologizing for opinions. She still sometimes felt the pull of the old equation, the one where her value lived in what she could produce. But she caught it now. That was the difference. She caught it, and she named it. sometimes out loud to Silas, who received these admissions without ceremony and without turning them into more than they were. And she made a different choice. Not always gracefully, not always the first time, but she made it. Her son grew up watching her make it. He watched her sit down before serving. He watched her disagree with his grandfather at the table and hold her ground when she was right, and change her position when she wasn't, which were equal measures of the same principle. He watched her build things. The East Slope garden that became, over 5 years, one of the most productive plots in the territory. The seed exchange she started with 3 other women who had good instincts and no outlet for them. The correspondence she eventually began with an agricultural journal further east that published 2 of her letters on rotation planting. He watched his father watch his mother. That was perhaps the most instructive thing. Not anything Silas said or did explicitly, but the quality of his attention. The way he listened when she spoke. The way he turned toward her in a room, automatically, the way you turn toward something that orients you. Their son grew up believing this was ordinary. That was the point. The Ashcroft Ranch passed through its own changes in those years. Her father's health began to slow him in his early 60s. Nothing catastrophic, just the accumulation of decades of physical work on a body that had never been asked to stop, the machinery wearing in ways that couldn't be fully repaired. He hired help for the first time in his life, which cost him something beyond the money, and he did not complain about it, which cost him something more. He came to the Mercer homestead more frequently in his slower years. He would sit on the porch that Silas had eventually gotten right, the boards even, the overhang properly angled, and watch the East Slope garden that his daughter had designed, and he would sometimes say things about it, and sometimes simply sit with it. One afternoon in his 64th year, when her son was 4 and was engaged in the serious project of building something small and probably doomed out of sticks near the porch steps, he said to Marin, "I think about what you said. In the barn. 2 years after your wedding. She was shelling beans. She kept shelling. Which part? That you made yourself useful so you wouldn't have to ask for anything, so you could earn your place." She waited. "I did the same thing," he said, "my whole life. Worked instead of talking. Provided instead of the other thing." "Being present," she said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know how to say this without it sounding like I'm asking you to feel sorry for me, which is not—" "I know what you're trying to say," she said. "Do you?" She looked at her father in the afternoon light. He had gotten smaller, the way working men do when the work starts to leave them. Not frail, but reduced to the essential, the way a tree looks in winter when there's nothing extra. He was still her father, still the man who had spent 15 years overlooking the daughter who never caused trouble, and still the man who had taught her to read land and to keep her word and to get up when it was hard. He was both things, the way people always are. "I know," she said, "that you loved us the way you knew how to. And I know the way you knew how to wasn't always enough. And I know you understand that now." She paused. "That's enough for me. I'm not interested in blame anymore. I'm interested in now." He nodded. He looked at his grandson, who had abandoned the sticks and was watching a beetle with the focused reverence of a 4-year-old who has discovered something that moves. "He's a good boy," her father said. "He is," she said. "You're a good mother." She looked at him, not as a reflex to deflect or minimize. She received it. "Thank you," she said. "I'm trying." "You're not trying," he said, with the blunt certainty of a man who has been watching his family carefully for 2 years and has formed opinions. "You're doing it." She went back to the beans. But she held it the way she had learned to hold things people said to her that were true and kind, without immediately finding the reason they might not be accurate, without locating the exit. He was right. She was doing it. Not perfectly, not without stumbling, not in the ways the books described it or the ways other women described it, or in any form that would have been recognizable to the version of herself who had lain awake 31 years ago, believing that she was not the kind of woman for whom these things were meant. But she was doing it. That had to count for something. She decided it counted for everything. Years later, when people in Caldwell Flats remembered Marin Mercer, and they did, for various reasons, what they remembered first depended on who was doing the remembering. Some remembered the harvest celebration. Harold Finch, who had eventually become something of a reformed character in the particular way of men who have been publicly and gracefully corrected by a woman they had underestimated, would tell the story with a rueful accuracy that increased as he aged. He had the grace, eventually, to tell it correctly, not as a story about a woman who had put him in his place, but as a story about a man who had not known he was looking at something remarkable and had needed to be shown. Some remembered the East Slope Garden, which became well known enough that people came to look at it in its fourth and fifth seasons, when what she had planted and tended had become something that demonstrated what difficult land could do under the right attention. She showed anyone who asked how the terracing worked, how the rotation worked, what the ground needed, and in what order, with the generous specificity of someone who had learned something worth passing on. Some remembered the Sunday suppers. This was what her son remembered, decades later, when he tried to explain his mother to his own children. Not the harvest speech. He had been too young for that and knew it only from the telling. Not the garden or the letters or any of the visible accomplishments. What he remembered was Sunday supper, and the way his father looked when his mother came through the door, and the fact that nobody ever started eating until she sat down, and what that had meant, growing up, about the value of a person's presence. Not what they produced, not what they provided, just them, at the table, as themselves, worth waiting for. His youngest daughter, Marin's granddaughter, who had the gray eyes and the direct gaze and the particular quality of attention that had apparently skipped the generations in between, asked him about it when she was 9. "Why did you always wait for great-grandma?" she said. He looked at her. She had that look, the one the family photograph showed on the face of her great-grandmother, the face of someone who asks because they actually want to know, not because they want to seem curious. He said what his father had told him, as best he could remember it. He had carried it for 40 years, and it had not changed shape. Because the first supper in their house only truly started when she sat down, he said, and after that, every meal did. She had a seat at the table, not because of what she could do, but because of who she was. And my father never forgot it for the rest of his life, so we didn't forget it either. His daughter thought about this with the serious, unhurried consideration of a 9-year-old who has not yet learned to pretend she understands things faster than she does. "That's a good reason," she said. "It is," he said. She reached for her bread and then stopped and looked around the table for her grandmother, his wife, who had stepped away briefly, and waited. He watched her do it. He had not asked her to. He had not taught it as a lesson or presented it as a rule. She had simply absorbed it, the way children absorb what they are shown when what they are shown is consistent and real. She waited until her grandmother came back and sat down. Then she ate. Outside the window, the land ran flat and wide to the horizon, the same land it had always been, patient and enormous and indifferent to the small human dramas played out on its surface, the dramas of who is seen and who is overlooked, who is chosen and who is passed by, who gets to sit at the table and who spends a lifetime standing at the stove. But inside, in the warm and complicated rooms that families make and fill and argue in and love each other badly and well across generations, a small girl waited for her grandmother to sit down before she started eating, and that the way these things always work was how it passed from one generation to the next, not through speeches or declarations or any of the dramatic moments that make stories worth telling, but through the ordinary repeated act of being seen and choosing to see others and refusing to let the habit die. Marin Ashcroft had been the plain unmarried sister. She had been the reliable one, the useful one, the one nobody chose first, and nobody thought to ask what she wanted or what she loved or whether she was all right. And then one man had walked past every woman in the room and asked only her to supper, and she had been brave enough eventually to say yes, not just to him, but to herself, to the full and demanding and imperfect life that followed, to the knowledge that she deserved a seat at every table she had ever served. She had not been saved by that. She had saved herself, slowly and without ceremony, in the daily choice to remain present rather than useful, visible rather than convenient, fully herself rather than a function of what others needed her to be. The land outside did not care. The land never did. But the people inside the warm rooms cared, and they remembered, and they showed their children, and their children showed theirs. And somewhere in that chain of ordinary love and imperfect seeing, the world changed. Not all at once, not dramatically, not in any way a history would record, but in the specific and irreversible way that it always changes. One person at a time, one table at a time, one small girl waiting for her grandmother to sit down before the meal begins.